So this does seem to be one of the biggest challenges of the gospel, that, Jesus says, love your enemies. And I figure that the way that Jesus talked about our relationships, he was pretty much talking about everyone, the way that we need to relate to everyone. That we don't just love the people who are in our tribe, in our group, but we look beyond those boundaries, and that we really need to exercise that same sort of care and concern for other people. If each one of us is amazingly created in God, and we get to include ourselves in that, hear that message that you are a special person created in God who deserves to be treated in a sacred way, but that we need to practice that same thing with almost everyone that we can come in contact with or see or think of or even imagine. That is a huge task. And so we start close in. That seems like a logical place to start, because actually sometimes it's the close-in relationships that can be the hardest. That those are the places where it's hardest to practice that recognition that I am in relationship with someone who is awesomely created by God. That when we're behaving like the human beings that we are, which is not always well, that is when it's a challenge for us to see the God in each other. But every relationship, because each of us contains that central place where God lives, each of us is in sacred relationship. Each relationship is sacred. Now, it seems to me that this call outside ourselves and outside our circles also indicates that we might need to be paying a slightly different attention to our relationships than what's presented in the culture. That in our culture we have all kinds of ideas about the people who are supposed to be the most important to us, the people we're married to, or the people that we live with, or the people that are relatives, or whatever. But actually our gospel and our religious tradition calls us beyond those boundaries, beyond the boundaries of tribe. And so if there is this sacred quality to relationships, it could be that in our lives right now, there are very special people that may be so important to us, and yet the shape of the relationship doesn't always match up the pictures in the culture. So we might have people that we care about deeply, that we're connected to in profound ways, but that may not be primary relationships or whatever that might be. And it seems like one of the gifts that God has given us is this ability to see and recognize the power of these relationships. When you're in community and church, actually you are called into that very direct relationship with people outside your circle. That seems to me one of the powers of this institution, that I get to hang out with people who are beyond my circle. And I am called to be in direct and special relationship with you all. In the Bible, there are a couple of stories that are often lifted up as examples of stories of relationships that worked in a slightly different way. And the first story I'm going to tell you has to do with David and Jonathon. I've read more of the book of Samuel this week than I probably ever have. Because the story of David in particular is a very long one in the Bible. But the backstory to this relationship between David and Jonathon was that in the land of Israel, for a long time, decisions seemed to be made, or the power seemed to rest in the prophets. And at one point, Samuel, who was one of these primary prophets, discerned or received a message from God that the people were asking for a king. And so the first king was anointed by Samuel, and that was Saul. Jonathon was Saul's son. And I'm not sure whether he would have been kind of in line for power. I'm not sure they had those rules yet. Since it was the first king, they probably hadn't made up the rules yet about succession. And we know we've got those rules down now, don't we? But anyway, Jonathon was the son of Saul. And David was a nobody. To begin with, he was the son of Jesse. And it came to pass that Saul was not behaving all that well as a king, and Samuel, the prophet, was not all that happy with the way that Saul was behaving. And so God said to him, I'm going to indicate to you who you might move in as you move Saul out. It's a little shift of power. And so this process went by, and I'm not going to tell you that part of the story. That'll be another time when we talk about David. But David, who was the most kind of the unlikely person, because number one, he was young. He was the youngest of Jesse's sons. And it was kind of like Jesse trotted out all of his sons first. Well, maybe this is the one. Samuel said, no, that's not the one. Brought it out, another one. It was kind of like the wicked stepsisters in the shoe. No, that's not the right one. No, that's not the right one. Finally, so they seemed to be running out of sons. And Jesse said, well, I have one more son, but he's out with the sheep, and he's young. He's kind of the runt of the family. But they brought David in, and Samuel recognized that this was the person who would be the next to have power. And through a long kind of story, David ended up in the court of Saul, and ended up being a bit of a competitor with Saul. And again, this is a long story, but a lot of back and forth. And actually, Jonathon made almost a direct connection with David early on. It was like the first time David was brought to the court, it said that Jonathon found this deep connection with him, and he gave David several signs of that sense of connection. And over time, as there was this kind of struggle for power, Jonathon was the one who was often feeding David information, sometimes at the risk of his own life, of Jonathan's own life. But they were deeply committed. At one point, Jonathon says, if I make it through this alive, continue to be my covenant friend. If I die, keep the covenant friendship with my family forever. And when God finally rids the earth of David's enemies, stay loyal to Jonathan. Jonathon repeated his pledge of love and friendship for David. He loved David more than his own soul. And a little bit later, there's a period where Jonathon is trying to get David a message about whether it's safe for him to come to Saul's court. And so David's hiding in a field, and Jonathon comes out to him, and it turns out actually it's a dangerous time. So David got up from his hiding place beside the boulder, then fell on his face to the ground 3 times, prostrating himself. And then they kissed one another and wept, friend over friend, David weeping especially hard. Jonathon said, go in peace. The 2 of us have vowed friendship in God's name, saying, God will be the bond between me and you, between my children and your children. So here was this friendship, this connection between these 2 men that seemed unlikely. They could have been competitors for the throne, and yet Jonathon saw something in David, and they saw something in each other, and that was what saved David's life. And then another story from the book of Ruth. There was a woman named Naomi, and she was married to a man. They lived in Judah, and there was a famine in the land, and so they decided to move to the country of Moab. And so essentially they were moving from where their people lived to the place of another tribe, another people. And so they moved, and it came to pass two things. One was that her husband died, and the other thing was that her sons took Moab women as wives. So they started to make this connection, direct connection with the Moabite people. But then the sons both died. And so there was Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, who were Orpah and Ruth. And of course, in this culture, women without men to take care of them, to provide for them, that was always a challenging situation. And at some point, Naomi learned that there was now food in the land of Judah, and so she decided that she needed to move back to where she came from. And actually, her daughters-in-law prepared to go with her, and they started out down the road. And this was a challenging thing for her to make this decision to move back. And the 2 daughters went with her, and as they went down the road a little bit, Naomi said, I really can't ask you to do this. I can't ask you to leave your people. I can't guarantee you'll find men to marry. I think you should go back. I think you should go back. And Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, did. She gave Naomi a hug and she returned to the lands of the Moabite people. But Ruth wouldn't part from her. Ruth said, well, she said this: "Where you go, I go. And where you live, I'll live. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. Where you die, I'll die. And that's where I'll be buried. So help me God. Not even death itself is going to come between us." So again, the relationships between these two women, which crossed over the practices of their people in so many ways, and yet the bond was so powerful and so deep that they made those decisions. Now, I've chosen two stories about relationships between people of the same gender. You can read into that what you will. But even though one of the points that I'm not going to dwell on today might be that actually there are people of the same gender who have had to fight to have their sacred relationships be named and claimed, the bigger issue really is that these sacred relationships, these very special relationships that we might have in our lives, might be surprising ones. They might not fit in the categories that have been. So look around you to see who it is that you love and you care for. Look around. Who are the people who have led you, who have been with you? Who are the people that would move to another country with you? Who are the people who would come bail you out at 3 o'clock in the morning? Who are the people who would bring you food when you were suffering? Who are the people who would cry with you, who would laugh with you, who would pray for you? It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter what those relationships are. Claim them because they are a gift from God. They are sacred relationships. They may be the people that you've lived with or partnered with for years and years, but they may not be. They may be related to you, or they may not be. But you will know in your heart, deep in your heart, who those people are. And for us to be able to claim those as part of our spiritual being, as part of the thing that feeds us, the thing that keeps us going, the things that provides us the sense of support that we need in the world, that can come from so many surprising places. Love me so much, you'll never give up. I'll love you so much, you'll never give up. We will not hold back our love. We are called by God, as challenging as that is, to not hold back our love. And where there is love, there must be justice. There must be equality. There must be fairness. There must be our ability to stand up for each other. Because sometimes the people that we're loving they're far away. It's much a bigger question, not just interpersonal. It's a bigger question. And our best way of acting is to bring justice into the world, into those relationships, with the people right next to us and the people who are far away. Amen.